The number one thing that could have saved thousands of lives would have been
the world's greatest expert on urban warfare, Colonel John Spencer.
Award-winning scholar and military analyst.
Considered one of the world's leading experts on urban warfare.
It's a political organization with an army that invaded on the morning of October 7th in a scale unseen really in modern times. They had studied every location that they were going to attack. Hamas military planning was very credible. The underground is more important than the surface to the enemy's strategy. That is where their fighters are, that's where the hostages are, that's where their leadership are.
They were manufacturing in Gaza.
Manufacturing in Gaza. But as I walked through that equipment, you saw everything from Russian, North Korean, Chinese. You have basically a highway going from Egypt into Gaza when you have to vaccinate the entire Gazan population from polio that was starting to spike. And Israel did that. There's never been a war where the attacking military feeds the enemy's population during the battle. Not World War I, II, Vietnam, Korea, none of them. To say that it was intentional, that you're just trying to scorch the earth, you're trying to destroy everything, it's not true. One of the biggest killers in Gaza has been...
I wondered if we might actually finish on the peace plan.
The 20-point plan as written is a...
Colonel Spencer, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me. Here in Israel, it is October 7th as we're talking now, and we've, I think, just heard that Hamas have accepted the Trump 20-point plan. But by the time this interview is released, who knows what could happen? We're still in war, I would say, to some extent. And you, throughout this 2 years of the Israel-Hamas war, which started, of course, on October 7th, have been in and out of Gaza. You are one of the world's preeminent, if not the preeminent, expert on urban warfare. Perhaps embarrassingly, I'm not sure, Prime Minister Netanyahu referenced you in his UN General Assembly speech 2 weeks ago in New York, and you have been speaking about the realities of war throughout this conflict. Now, of course, this is a conflict on several fronts. We've got southern Lebanon in the north, Syria, Iran, there's Gaza, and there's the propaganda war is, I guess, another front. But I wanted to, if possible, speak with you about specifically the conflict in Gaza. Now, just last point on the framing of this conversation, it seems to me that from the very beginning of the war, there's been a total asymmetry when it comes to information. Let's say at the Al-Ali hospital, it blows up, or there's a bomb. Suddenly, there's a lot of hoo-ha about what happened, accusations it's the IDF that have targeted. It later transpires that it's Islamic Jihad. One of their missiles has gone awry. And what you end up is with a lot of the media is taken up with accusations of famine, accusations of genocide, accusations of all of these misdoings by Israel, whether or not they're true. But the reality of the conflict itself seems to be lost. So we don't ever really hear about what are the objectives, what are the strategies and tactics, not least because the IDF are not going to say all of those things. They can't say everything because they can't reveal their strategy against Hamas. So I'm not sure if you appreciate how I've just framed this conversation, but what I'm hoping to get from you is a picture of the conflict in strategic military terms from October 7th. Now, I appreciate that that's quite a lot to get through, but it still would be useful to understand that side of that's what I want to understand. So if you're okay with that, and unless you object to any of my framing there, perhaps we can start with October 7 itself, the launch from Gaza by Hamas into Israel of what they called the Al-Aqsa flood mission. Am I right in understanding that was supposed to be part of a joint effort from all of the neighbors of Israel, including Hezbollah in the north, Iran, the Houthis, and a joint attack which Hamas were too early on and got ahead on? And what do we know about the Al-Aqsa flood now, 2 years later?
Sure. And thanks for having me on, Winston. A big fan of this show. So we are on the 2-year, I guess you could say, anniversary of the attack. And I have now been back. This is my 7th trip. I wanted to get here immediately after October 7th to understand from a military analysis, October 7th. Some people call it a terrorist attack. It was a terrorist attack. It'll go down in history as one of the largest terrorist attacks. But it was more than that. It was like it was an invasion. From every military definition, it was an invasion by another entity, which happened to be a terror military. But it's more than an insurgent or terrorist force like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, anything like that. I mean, Israel left Gaza in 2005, 2006, they're elected, 2007, they seized power. It's a political organization with an army, and it built an army that invaded on the morning of October 7th in a scale unseen really in modern times. You're right, though, that it was a coordinated attack with other entities, mainly Hezbollah in the north, which is a much larger military with vast more resources on the northern border of Israel, which had already set up all the equipment. And they discovered this after the fact. The mopeds, the GoPros, all of the equipment ready to go just on the other side of the border to launch onto the Golan Heights and other areas in October 7th from that direction. And you have to think of there's Hamas in other places other than Gaza, right? There's Hamas in Judea and Samaria. There's Hamas in Lebanon. There were other entities even within what's called the West Bank that were supposed to rise up. You're right because of the military necessity, even for Hamas, to have secrecy on their operation. Mm-hmm. And they also had trust issues. So Hamas and Hezbollah are not the same in any way, even religious sects. You have a Shia, Sunni kind of divide, but they were aligned in their, just like the Islamic regime in Iran aligns all of its proxies with the unified goal of the destruction of Israel, and then the Western way of living part of that. Mm-hmm. So like you said, it's pretty much known information now, one, that this was an Islamic regime in Iran-backed operation. So intelligence found in Gaza since October 7th shows that direct connection to Hezbollah or to Hamas.
Right.
But the same thing with Hezbollah is that there is now intelligence showing that Hamas didn't necessarily jump the gun because it made its decisions on why it launched on this holiday morning. There was protests going on against the Israeli government beforehand. They felt that there was a lot of division in the society. They just felt it was the right time. But they didn't trust Nasrallah and Hezbollah. So it wasn't they didn't just not send the message. They didn't trust them. So they were hoping that once they invaded, that flag would go up and then people would join them like they were supposed to.
How do you know they didn't trust Nasrallah? Again,
more intelligence found in Gaza since October 7th. So they found, like the intelligence about Iran, but also the Hezbollah mistrust. So like Yahya Sinwar's personal messages and things in the way they communicated to Hezbollah, that's really why we pretty much know that as a fact, that there is a trust issue. And if you just know the differences in the two organizations, like there's no reason even why they should work together other than for the unified destruction. And to be clear, Hezbollah did join the fight on October 8th. It just didn't send the October 7th wave because Nasrallah made another calculation, which he made multiple since October 7th, that are somewhat unusual. Even when Israel invaded southern Lebanon or attacked into it, Hezbollah pulled back its Red One forces because it didn't want them destroyed. Everybody's always thinking the strategy, the long-term strategy.
Doesn't that suggest that Hezbollah weren't nearly as prepared that they should have been if they really genuinely thought it was a good idea to invade Israel? On the topic of Palestine, let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Starmer's decision to recognize a Palestinian state using ground news. Left-leaning The New Arab ran the headline, "Activists demand more meaningful action, end to arms sales after Palestine recognition." Contrast that with right-leaning The Daily Skeptic, who led with, "Keir Starmer confirms Britain will ignore US and Israeli anger and recognize a Palestinian state." Two very different narratives from the left and the right on the same story. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website helped me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any story like this one. There are over 240 articles published on Starmer's decision, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source, context, and key breakdowns. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential to cutting through media bias and getting informed the right way. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded. So by supporting my sponsors, you're also supporting this show.
I mean, they had prepared everything. So if you understand the way that Hezbollah was arrayed in southern Lebanon is that they weren't always there. They had tunnels and pre-positioned positions in the wood lines and things that were all of the people disguised as civilians that were Hezbollah would come and then go into the environment and grab what their equipment pre-positioned. So they have found multiple bunkers full of that equipment ready to go. But you're right, they weren't in the bunkers on the morning of October 7th ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
And to send them afterwards, you're right, to send them immediately after the October 7th happened, then they would be visible to the Israelis who were launching towards northern, because that was a big fear of theirs. So Israel had to make a big decision, and I've talked to General Gallant and the Prime Minister about that decision of whether to reinforce the north where the largest threat could come from, or the south. And if Nasrallah had sent the Red One after October 7th, not been a part of the surprise attack when Israel was basically blind for multiple reasons, then they would have confronted a lot less than had they gone. So then you make a decision on, well, if we go now, we'll lose a lot more soldiers. So they decided on the easy card, Hezbollah did, and just started launching rockets on October 8th.
When you say Israel were blind for multiple reasons,
yes.
What do you mean by that?
So the way that you have to give credit, and I've written about this, the way that Hamas did the operation. Not only did there were signals that on the night of October 6th that it was something really bad was getting ready to happen, right? So one of the biggest things was the SIM cards in Gaza were switched to Israeli SIM cards so they could operate in Israel. And that was a big thing throughout the night. Like, is this a rehearsal? Because they had done it before. Hamas had done this before. And
they'd done the SIM card thing before. Okay.
And they've done basically a readiness drill like this to get everybody up and ready and get all the people and the fighters. They're a military, so they rehearsed attack. And the Israeli intelligence and military people on the night of October 6th are like, is this a test or a rehearsal again, or is it the real thing? And they had to, there's a lot of history there on making that wrong decision. But after they launched, the way that Hamas launched is that they had studied every location that they were going to attack. So all the 20-plus urban sites, Faraza, all of them, they had studied them in detail, but they'd also studied Israeli responses. Even you go back to the test of the wall, like Hamas did its work in analyzing what Israel might do. So when they entered, they knocked out all the cameras immediately. So they sent quadcopters and other things and knocked out all the cameras that Israel relies on as early warning and to be able to see what's going on in the border. Mm-hmm. They tried to bring down cell phone towers. So they went immediately to the cell phone towers and tried to bring down the cell phone towers. They went to locations where anybody might come and discover what's going on or come as a reinforcement. So I know you've driven down there, the 232. They sent platoons of Hamas special forces, the Nukba fighters, to the locations to set up ambushes so nobody could come into southern Israel. And then you have the last element of blinding Israel was the EMS system. And I've discovered this in other terrorist attacks like the Mumbai attacks of 26/11 is that 911 here it's 611, but when you call it can only receive so many calls. So now you have this massive invasion and everybody's dialing 911 basically, and you overload the emergency system to the point where they start diverting calls to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and then in the chaos of that, nobody can communicate, nobody understands what's going on. And this is, as I analyze even the morning of October 7th till the mid-afternoon, there's people who fight terrorists and think that it's done because they don't know that there's 20-plus breaches of the perimeter wall, that there's thousands of Hamas, and then waves of Palestinians that are coming in. It just, not only the chaos, but they were very deliberate in how they blinded not just Israel's defense forces, its security forces, but even the nation to not know what's going on. So that's why we, from the outside world on X, are seeing videos and we know as much as the Israeli authorities do at that point.
And that chaos was enough to hinder the IDF in a quick response.
Well, that blinding and the deliberate, and I taught this, and I wrote this, actually I reposted the Time Magazine article. I mean, I taught at our U.S. Army Ranger School. I taught militaries how to attack other enemy areas, and Hamas military planning was very credible. So they sent these ambush locations, not just to the entire envelope, what they call it, southern Israel, like the 232, let's say where the Black Aerial Monument is, to lock it down. So you want to lock down your objective. Their objective was all of southern Israel. They locked that down, but they also locked down any location they were attacking, like Faraza, Re'im, all of them. And then they would put out sniper positions and ambush positions to lock it down, so that way the fighters inside could do what they wanted to do with no worry of anybody coming to save the other people.
Mm-hmm. So there's an argument that's been made quite regularly, which is that Hamas, after choosing to invade Israel, then chose to have the theater of war be Gaza itself, because there they are able to fight a type of war where they can hide behind their own civilians and thus create a furore and create propaganda and down the line accuse Israel of genocide and win on the propaganda war on the world stage. Did they believe on October 7th they were actually going to have a successful multi-front invasion of Israel and succeed in destroying Israel?
I agree, and I've heard these conversations. Like, I don't give Hamas that much credit to that. Everything that's unfolded since October 7th was their plan. I agree that there was definitely deliberate planning, and this is even evidence of the fighters. They brought in food with them, medicine. They planned to stay. They had maps to other sites, like the nuclear site in the south.
But they planned to stay, or they planned to stay there as long as they could, to cause as much trouble as they could, to eventually bring everything back to Gaza. Seeing as we know a bit, you've already suggested we know a bit about strategy. What was in the leadership of Hamas at that point? What do we know?
So since the taking of hostages was such a deliberate strategy, although there is some chaos there where you have civilians taking hostages, you have other fighters, since we know that was a deliberate part, that was definitely part of the plan of Yahya Sinwar, is to capture the hostages as their ultimate, as they know from recent history of any hostage taking, that will, no matter what happens, garner immense amounts of credit, basically, or ability to negotiate things. But no, I do believe like you said, that there are many courses of action here, and their primary course of action was to stay as long as they could and destroy as much as Israel as they could, and they were sacrificing the fighters in that effort, right? Because we have this thing called rational actor theory, and people think that it applies to everybody. And where you see ration in their strategy, there's also irrationality of their strategy of, it doesn't matter if all the fighters die, their goal is in the afterlife of achieving martyrdom and, the destruction of Israel eventually.
Right.
But since we know so much about their first phase of the invasion was to stay as long as they could, to have other people rise up and join them, and to create as much of destruction. So it's just a little bit of yes and no. Yes, that they had multiple phases of the operation, to include taking the hostages back into Gaza, and I just wrote the case study on the first Gaza war in 2008, and knowing that they could survive immense amounts of attack and they did it back then in 2008 too, the international media, the numbers game, the tunnel network to defend themselves, all of this. But that doesn't mean they didn't have a primary plan of destroying as much and doing as much as this as possible, with everybody else joining them and having that be the primary plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like this is a backup plan. And even within that, I don't think they believed, even within their own strategic analysis, that Israel could continue the operation as long as they have, seeing what's happened in the last 2 years, like you said, on a 7-front war. And this is getting into, again, Hezbollah. Hamas's strategy didn't calculate Hezbollah's actions. And Hezbollah was a big deterrent during the first phases of this war to what should we do? Because if Hezbollah launched even its rocket supplies, 100,000 rockets, at that point, precision-guided munition, everything, immense amounts of destruction could be done to Israel, way farther than what was done on October 7th. And then you have the Iran card, where if Hezbollah launched, because I was, again, interviewing all the senior leadership, the biggest concern about if Hezbollah launches is if Israel responds to Hezbollah, then Iran verbally states, if you touch Hezbollah, we're coming in. And right. Iran has come in, right? So I don't give Hamas credit for all that.
Right. Okay. But then, as you say that, it just goes to show what an incredible feat it has been for Israel in response to deal with that multi-front war. The timing of each operation, each theater to be approached, it's like the ultimate game. It's 7D chess.
That's right. And resources, right? So this ends ways and means, we say. You're right. Everybody outside of that doesn't visit here thinks Israel's this all-powerful, despite its small size. And, like the ridiculousness of, well, if they can do that to Hezbollah with the pagers and the strategic strikes, why couldn't they do that with Hamas? Just the ignorance of warfare. But most people don't look at it like you just said, as in Israel has resources, but a very minimum resource compared to the amount of threat they're facing. So to navigate not just the resource constraint of basically a citizen army that you need to mobilize, but then put back into the economy, and mobilize, put back in, right, and keep doing that.
Yes, I hadn't even considered that.
So you don't have a standing army that can do all this at once, and they couldn't. So they have to make these really bad decisions of where do you fight and navigate those strategic waters of all of the internationalness, even the 12-day war. Like, you got to give Israel credit for basically diminishing, dismantling, defanging, destroying their enemies one at a time over the last 2 years.
Yes, quite. So before we come to the IDF invasion of Gaza, which began on October 27th, I would love to get a picture of what the munitions and weaponry of Hamas was in Gaza, or at least what we know. Of course, we know about their tremendous terror tunnels, but what did they have in stock? What presumably we must have some sense of or they must have had some sense of their own capabilities.
Sure. And you can say with any embedded intelligence is that there's a really good history of intelligence being wrong. So they mostly get it wrong, but they try to get it as least wrong as possible. So the estimates of Hamas going after October 7th is 30 to 50,000. That's a pretty big...
Terrorists,
fighters in Hamas's military. But, and I think we were talking about that before the show comes into play, is that in my world, there isn't one terrorist and civilian. There is combatant and non-combatant. So after October 7th, Israel invokes self-defense and wages a war against Hamas, the political organization, its military. So the numbers I'm giving you are of its military, 30 to 50,000 fighters, 5 brigades, 24 battalions arrayed across the Gaza Strip in defensive positions that they've been working on for 20 years, which really matters, that they've prepared every ground of Gaza for war for over 20 years, which gets you to the tunnel network, but that's not the only thing. So 30 to 50,000 fighters, but then you have what is now believed to be over 20,000 short-range rockets, because they launched 4,000 rockets in the opening morning of October 7th, which was more than was launched in the entire Second Lebanon War in the opening hours. But they had 20,000 of these.
But these are not great rockets, right? These are pretty small warheads.
Small warheads with no precision capabilities,
right?
Which really matters, because when you're lobbing them towards, if everybody wants to talk about laws of war, if you lob missiles towards a city, a civilian area, you don't have the ability to distinguish, which is one of the principles of where it's going, then it's a war crime. So these, like you said, lower yield, but they're still very dangerous, especially in quantity, but even a single one will kill people. 20,000 of those ranging in warhead size.
Up to what's the largest warheads we have?
I don't know that, actually. I'll say what I don't know, because it's so varied, because one of their manufacturing capability Israel didn't know about. Like, they just discovered one last week.
They were manufacturing in Gaza.
So that's the other kind of surprise, is that people thought this was all basically either kind of jerry-rigged or homemade stuff or imported and smuggled in. But it was a combination of it all. And actually, they just found another one in northern Gaza last week, a weapons manufacturing plant underground. So with military lathes and everything. We've seen the videos of them cutting up their water pipes to create rockets, but they had everything from militarized versions that they imported in to the ones they homemade. And we know that they use the munitions, so they've manufactured since October 7th, because they use the unexploded ordnance of IDF bombs and artillery, and they'll take the explosives out of that, because that's usually your dependent variable of creating rockets is the explosives that you need.
Right.
I mean, you need some propellant, but it's really the explosive. But they're really big on taking the unexploded ordnance that Israel has dropped or fired and using that to make the rockets in which they send. But on October 7th, over 20,000 is what they believe at this point was available to the Hamas military. Then you have a whole range of the small arms capabilities. So the IED is probably one of, just like any asymmetric, as you were talking about, fighter, one of their biggest assets is the IEDs. So the IEDs in the roads, in the tunnels, in the walls, in the homes. And then they have the whole array of small arms, RPGs, AK-47s, sniper rifles, all of those. Very limited night vision goggles, some, but very limited thermals, but from a military perspective, 50,000 fighters just in their military, which gets you to the the recruitment and other militaries in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
So you have and I know you know this, but when you start talking about, like you said, just what's in the environment as Israel's about to approach, is that people believe that you have Hamas and then everybody else, and they're not involved. Well, in my world, you have combatants and non-combatants. A non-combatant is a civilian who's not participating in the conflict. But as soon as the war begins, anybody who's in Hamas, a named card-carrying member of Hamas, can be killed. Doesn't matter what they're doing. Now, if they're somebody else like Palestinian Islamic Jihad or just a civilian and they participate in the hostilities in any way, like shoot at the idea, report intelligence on the idea, hold a hostage. So a civilian who holds a hostage is now a member of the organization that is fighting in the war.
Would you include someone who knows where the hostages are but doesn't report on it?
No.
No. Okay.
And this isn't John Spencer's interpretation. The laws of war, which I'm a big advocate for, I think people need to have War 101 classes, really, and this war has really exposed it, but other ones have. It's very prescriptive on what is the definition of participating in the hostilities. And there's a whole list of them. You could be a guy who carries the ammo, or that person on the cell phone on a rooftop who's reporting on intelligence, right, or with a camera, which is, I know, very recent in history, a camera on the IDF. That's participating in the hostilities and can be targeted. So,
right. Do you think there's anything to the report that some of the weaponry left behind by America in Afghan in the 2021 Joe Biden pullout from Afghanistan made its way to Gaza?
Sure, but not at a scale that would have an impact.
Not at a scale.
And I actually toured a lot of the stuff that was left after October 7th. So, there's been some videos of it. And as I walked through this, which is very impressive equipment, even the thermobaric grenades they made homemade, which is thermobaric is a very lethal way of sucking the oxygen out of an environment, a room, and then replacing it with fire, the vacuum bombs, everything. But as I walked through that equipment, you saw everything from Russian, North Korean, Chinese, American. I've heard that in the beginning, but it wasn't like it was like troves of it. Really, I mean, if you think about the post-Benghazi, more of those weapons would have made it into Gaza than stuff that was left in Afghanistan, just by terrain-wise.
Right, okay. So when you say, let's say, like you mentioned China, that you're not suggesting that China it's made its way there
illicit
over
arms
years,
market,
perhaps over decades, right? So some of this will be old weaponry.
That's right. And now that we know, and not that we didn't know, although there's a history there between the Egypt-Gaza border, right, and the tunnels. So they found over 100, not saying 100 were used, after October 7th between Egypt and Gaza that you could drive trucks through. So it isn't hard to think about how weapons got into Gaza. And you have basically a highway going from Egypt into Gaza. And if you just know the right people to pay, even though in 2017, Egypt went through a whole campaign, very little international attention, where they eradicated the population on their side of the fence. So there used to be a Rafah on the Egypt side of Gaza that they told them all to go somewhere else. They don't care where they went, and they knocked down thousands of houses. They filled the tunnels with sewage and seawater, and they tried to eliminate because they were having a problem with terrorism,
Right.
The cross-borderness between Gaza and Egypt.
So I had British military expert Andrew Fox on the show, and I came away from that conversation under the impression that the IEDs, as you mentioned, have been pretty crucial in shaping how the war played out in Gaza. And I'd love your opinion on this. The way he described it to me was these were IEDs that had camera operated. So the Hamas can leave the IEDs wherever they want. With cameras looking at them, they're not tripwires, and they don't need to be detonated with someone nearby. Well, obviously they wouldn't be. But in trying to deal with that, the IDF, they come in. They as soon as they walk into the building, Hamas know to trigger and set off the IED. So as a consequence, the IDF have tried to evacuate civilians or non-combatants, as you'd say, and then send in airstrikes to flatten certain areas, as that's the easiest way to get rid of all of these IEDs without themselves falling prey to the IEDs. And as a consequence of that is we see this total sort of desolation and wipeout of Gaza. Do you sort of agree with? Have I understood that correctly? And is this a sort of IED war?
So, yes and no. Again, as the academic in me likes to put what we call the yes and. Absolutely, that's a factor. Definitely not an IED war. If anything, it's a tunnel war.
It's a tunnel war.
This is the first war that I've ever studied, and I'm currently studying multiple wars right now in Ukraine, writing a book about the Azerbaijan War 2020. Unlike any other, even urban-centric warfare that I ever studied, the underground is more important than the surface to the enemy's strategy. So for Hamas, that is where their fighters are, that's where the hostages are, that's where their leadership are, that's where the IEDs are as well. But in explaining some of the surface damage in high-intensity urban conflict, you absolutely have to discuss the other component of Hamas's terrain denial, which is this use of the IEDs in pervasive IEDs, unlike other people can comprehend. So it's right to just talk about it. That's not the only tactic that the IDF does to deal with these, but we've seen, IEDs go, it's kind of like urban, like it's hard to talk about, like, okay, when did it start? Even the IEDs that we faced in Iraq and Afghanistan are an offshoot of things like the Lebanon, what we call the EFPs came out of Lebanon. They're a Hezbollah Shia militia kind of asset that the Islamic regime in Iran then pushed into Iraq and later into Afghanistan. The use of IEDs is just an asymmetric guerrilla warfare tactic. In Gaza, it's very useful to talk about because people believe that all the damage is just Israel bombing against targets that they see. Definitely a part of it. It's snipers, it's the close battle, but it's also the IED because they do things like not just, and it's hard to discuss an IED, what Andrew was talking about with those, which is a evolution of the IED, right? So there's always a game of, if you're an IED emplacer, how to get it to go off when you want it to. There's so many ways to do it. And one of the ways that Hezbollah started using was these wire control, as in cameras, fixed cameras that are sending a signal to somewhere else, usually hardwired, not Wi-Fi, because there's ways to deal with that. And then also command detonating the explosive without electronic, because electronic, as the IED evolution has happened, I can block all electronic signals in an area as I enter them so that nothing can blow up because of an electronic signal. Like a car fob was really famous in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they just hit their car fob and it sends a signal to it. But if you hardwire it all, and again, if you've had 20 years, which is the difference here that as somebody who studied urban warfare across time, the biggest difference that we're talking about here is that Hamas has prepared that ground for 20 years. And then if you have 20 years, you can be really creative on how you place IEDs, how you build tunnels, how you even set up kill zones. So many elements of it.
You know, I was online the other day and I stumbled across this video. It was from Chuck Norris, and it left me a little shocked. He's in his 80s and says he feels like he's in his 50s. He had some pretty cool tips in there too on what he's doing, including these 3 foods that he avoids like the plague. Now, at first I was a bit skeptical, but he explained all the things he was doing, and it was super simple. If it's good enough for Chuck, then it's good enough for all of us. But with any new method, of course, results can vary. The video is definitely worth checking out, and here is a special link just for you watchers of The Winston Marshall Show. Watch the video now at chuckdefense.com/win. That's Chuck Defense. That's a defense with an S rather than a C, .com/win. To make it even easier, I linked it below the video and you can check it out yourself. It's pretty quick and seriously, it's been a game changer. Now, back to the interview.
When people see the destruction, though, it is good to remind them about the IEDs. Because people think about IEDs, if they're thinking about Iraq, Afghanistan, they're thinking about roadside bombs. Where in Gaza, there are roadside bombs that are killing IDF soldiers, but an entire house has been marked as an explosive, as in the entire house is rigged to blow. So you enter it, it blows up, which is not new in urban warfare either, but the street, the wall in the street, I mean, it's just pervasive that once you have evacuated civilians, like you said, and the IDF have been very successful at evacuating civilians, especially before the close fight when you would face an IED. But of course, if you know there's an IED in a building, then you can, of course, bomb that building. Same thing if there's a sniper in that building or an enemy in that building, you can bomb it. But there's also ways of an entire street is embedded with IEDs, but you know you have to go into it. So one of the, and I think the Prime Minister mentioned it in a briefing, so it's not classified, where they'll take an old armored personnel carrier, fill that armored personnel carrier full of explosives, and then drive it down the street and then blow the vehicle, so then it blows all the IEDs that are along that street. There are many ways, and this is when you get people who look at the photos and say, why did this happen? And there's not one reason that destruction is there. There's like a whole list of reasons, and the number one reason though is Hamas. And to say that it was intentional, that you're just trying to scorch the earth, you're trying to destroy everything, it's not true. And there's so many of these things that are happening, like the IEDs, like the tunnel networks, like the buildings rigged to blow, caches in them, that are part of the explanation.
You've said, and this is a quote I have from Jake Wallace-Simons' book, that since the IDF have been giving warnings and conducting evacuations before having to do what you've just described, this has helped Hamas survive and ultimately prolonged the war, and with it, the devastation. So, tactically, it doesn't sound like... Why did the IDF decide to make that trade-off? Was it for their own... to appear to be doing the right thing? Was it for noble reasons? Or if it has indeed backfired... why was that a mistake? Do you think they would have done it differently now, knowing that, or how do you explain it?
It's not easy to explain quickly, unfortunately, because even in that statement, which is I'm quoted, and I'll stand by this. Again, people can have their own opinion; they can't have their own facts. As somebody who studied urban warfare for over a decade, written on almost every major urban battle that a Western military has been a part of, Israel has done more, as in implemented more measures to prevent civilian harm than any military in history. The notifications is a big part of it. Now you are like the statement that the notifications have protracted the war. There are many things that have protracted this war and prevented the IDF from achieving their goals, or even Israel. The number one thing that has happened, which is very ahistorical in none of the urban battles or wars I've ever studied, is the fact that the civilians are trapped in a very small area. So Gaza is 25 miles long, 5 to 7 miles wide, 2.2 million people. Although that's a lot. I fought in a neighborhood of Baghdad that was 2.2 million. It's a 6 million person city. But in this case of Gaza is that there's never been a case like this where one country, Egypt, has said, I don't care who you are, civilians cannot come out of Gaza into my country. I have no other example of that. So that leads you to the IDF being faced with impossible conditions of figuring out a way to get to the enemy while getting his or her, I guess, population out of the harm's way, which is kind of embedded in all of the laws of war. If you look at all the laws of war, they're pretty much all directed towards preventing harm against those not involved in the war.
But if you're telling them to evacuate, presumably Hamas then just evacuate. And so they themselves will just follow the civilians. Is that what's happened? If Hamas followed the civilian population around Gaza, wherever they've been moved to throughout the last 2 years?
It's been a big part of it. And again, that one's not as easy to answer as you think as well. Definitely in the beginning when the focus was on northern Gaza, and the focus was on northern Gaza because that was where the center of gravity of the Hamas military was, Israel said, everybody evacuate to south of the Wadi Gaza, which is almost a repeat what we're seeing now, although it's been successful, is that you're right. Hamas just moved, not to say, but some stayed. So that's also been the uniqueness that, yes, Hamas moved. You told them you're coming. You told them exactly where you're going, which is crazy that the IDF isn't given credit for trying to prevent civilian harm by giving up all elements of surprise. They started handing out their maps, like literally telling them even in a neighborhood, like today I'll be in this area of the map. If you're a civilian, get out of there or stay away from this area, which also tells the enemy.
Yes, quite.
But
Israel, by the way, as a side, this answers the question is why is it that Israel can be so precise when it comes to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon or Iran in the 12-day war, but it's such a different story when it comes to Hamas.
The goals are different.
Yeah.
So this is the apples to oranges, every element of the comparative, even that comparison, right? So what happened in southern Lebanon before Israel did that is that it gave notification and the entire population of southern Lebanon left.
Yes.
They had somewhere to go.
Right. I will say, though, in response, I was just in southern Lebanon about a month ago, and the stories I was being told was like, oh, yeah, I was driving around Tyre, and on the radio, Israel came on the radio and said, back off away from that car. So they were able to tell other civilians to back away from Hezbollah targets in real time. So then I guess the question would be, why then were they not able to do that in Gaza? It's a huge ask, and I don't imagine any other military in history has been asked why it won't warn individuals around.
But it has, right? So it does. So even the practice of roof knocking, and we're seeing it even now in Gaza City, the Battle of Gaza City. There's a building that the IDF identify has military purpose for it, whether it's holding Hamas fighters, used for communication, whatever. They call everybody in that building, say, please evacuate this building. You have an hour. It's something they've done in the past. So they actually do it in Gaza as well, but there are so many differences on the density of the population, the notification, the types of targets, the intelligence variables. So they're actually doing it in Gaza as well, but the contexts are also massively different. But you have to give the IDF credit for the way they notify civilians. And not just the flyers that they drop, but the same thing with the TV, social media, radio, direct calls. And they've aired some of these where they'll call a family in Gaza. They did it in Rafah, where they had a very high percentage of evacuation, where they will call a father of a family and say, is this so-and-so? Yes, this is so-and-so. This is the IDF. How many people do you have in your home? This many. Please evacuate. I'd rather die, is what the person says on the other end. It's just crazy to say that the IDF haven't gone above and beyond what's anybody's ever done in the past. So nobody's ever done these phone calls, voice messages, drones, handing out their maps. None of that. And they keep it up because all warfare is always a balance between the military objective and the humanitarian imperatives. So even when the law says you can and can't do this, there's always a factor of you still need to do everything reasonable and feasible to limit civilian harm. And Israel has done that in spades in a condition that no other military has ever faced, especially in Gaza, with the civilians being trapped and creating this problem of even the enemy going into the safest areas like al-Mawasi. Where was Mohammed Deif, who is the commander, the ghost of Gaza, the number one commander of Hamas for 3 decades? He was killed near al-Mawasi humanitarian zone, where he was using the one area that's supposed to be safe for civilians as a shield to hide himself.
Right. Is there anything I've missed in this conversation so far on Hamas military capability. So we've talked a decent about their missiles, IED use, and then they will have had some artillery, presumably, and some
mortars.
Mortars,
Not
okay.
artillery. They have mortars, medium to light mortars. The sniper threat is really big there. So the sniper threat is as big as
they're snipers.
They're snipers.
Okay.
Every time that I've gone in, it's been a very high threat. The ID threat is always evolving, and it is a faceless, really hard to combat threat. Although, again, Israel is very creative in how they lead with the bulldozer, things like that are help minimize. But you always have to look at.
What do you mean they lead with a bulldozer?
So Israel, unlike any military outside of the few high intensity fights that the Western military have been involved in, like the Battle of Fallujah or even Mosul, Mawari, Israel is the only military in the world that by design leads with this very large bulldozer, a D9 bulldozer, in front of their formation going into a contested urban environment. Because not only can it take the hit of any IED, doesn't matter what it is, it can take the hit of any RPG or anything that the enemy wants to stop it. You can't stop it. So if the IDF are going into an area, any neighborhood, they're usually leading with that bulldozer just as a protective element to clear the way and protect the tank that's behind it, with the infantry personnel carrier that's behind that, with the infantry on the ground behind that. That bulldozer becomes the critical piece of equipment. It really became important during this war when, like the U.S. administration said, I'm not going to send you Caterpillar bulldozer replacement parts. And everybody's like, oh, that doesn't matter. No. They're saying they're going to take away on one of the most critical things that protects the IDF in Gaza.
So October 27th, 20 days after, we've only done 20 days of the war so far. October 27th, the IDF launched their full-scale ground invasion of Gaza.
Yep.
I've read it was 100,000 troops. Is that accurate, or is that an overstatement?
No, it's an understatement.
Oh, right.
Yeah, because then how do you measure tooth versus tail? What divisions are actually penetrating versus fighter versus logistics? So there are over 300,000 that were mobilized on October 8th. Probably about 300,000 arrayed around Gaza. When you get into pushing into Gaza, so the 4 divisions that are pushing in, if you counted those, you get to about 100,000 yet. But
okay.
it's way more than that.
And that's into northern Gaza.
They went into they attacked every element. Some people argue they should have attacked greater into southern, but if you look at the array of divisions, it's 3 divisions in northern Gaza, and then 1 division central Gaza, and 1 division towards southern. What their goal isn't the same as the 3 divisions, since northern Gaza was the main effort. And when they had 1 division that punched their way all the way to the coast, through the middle, along where the Netanyahu corridor is now, and then you had the 2 divisions that come, unlike, I'm sure it's a question, unlike Hamas wanted you to, which is the one principles of warfare is never fight the way the enemy wants you to fight. So Israel went around the 20 years of defensive lines that Hamas had built, which were arrayed towards Israel. So Israel's 3 divisions, 1 punched all the way to the coast, the other 2 hit northwest Gaza and came down the shoreline and punched in behind them.
Okay, but do they choose to do northern Gaza because that's where they believe the hostages were? What was the tactical decision to go there specifically?
It's a combination of factors. Some being where hostages were, right? So Al-Shifa Hospital, hostages taken there. Northern Gaza, though, was the center of gravity of the Hamas military. Militaries like to fight militaries, so the IDF knew that was the strongest place of the Hamas military, which is a capability, right? So
would that have been in Gaza City, or where in northern Gaza would it have been?
The areas
all over the whole.
Okay, so you have Bet Hanun, Sajaiya, Jabalia, all of those places.
Okay.
And it also set the conditions to open the entire northern area. But that was, again, you have to think about too, as in what's the closest location to Israel, right? So if you look Ashkelon, northern Gaza, that's a threat. What's the easiest place to move civilians? Southern Gaza. So if you sweep them, which they did, there's 2 roads they told them to go along, go to the Al-Mawasi Humanitarian Zone, which is a coastal area. The only place where There's the least amount of Hamas infrastructure. So there are many variables that identify why go into northern Gaza. Yes, hostages. Yes, the strength of the Hamas military is there, but also proximity to Israel, how to get the civilians out of harm's way. And at the time, it wasn't known that Egypt would lock its gate and build a new gate and send an armored division there, say, no civilians coming out. Again, the number one thing that could have sped this war up, so we talk about protracted the war, or prevented civilian harm, saved thousands of lives, would have been to move civilians into a displaced person camp in the Sinai Desert, and every international agency would have access to them, and there would not have been a problem.
But you say that, but wouldn't Hamas have just followed with them?
So, no. So it's actually historical in urban warfare to do this, to evacuate everybody, but you search them on the way out. And Israel started to do it later. You asked me about northern Gaza. Later, they start doing facial recognition stands where they're scanning the crowds. And at Al-Nasser Hospital and Khan Yunis, where I'm there, they're very effective at identifying Hamas terrorists in the crowd that are trying to blend in, even in what we call call-outs of hospitals. Now, Nasser Hospital in February of 2024, the IDF encircle it, they evacuate everybody out, use facial recognition, they pick out 700 Nukba fighters that are hiding in the hospital dressed as patients or doctors. And they use that facial recognition. So it's historical that if they would have gone into Egypt, that they would have been searched on the way out.
Right.
And I'm not saying that if you're somebody who, I guess if you're on the Hamas cause, if you understand warfare, it isn't that these people get killed. There is a reconciliation process that happens after wars. So there's an echelon of Hamas, right? You have Hamas political bureau, you have Hamas's military, but I don't think the Hamas military would have been foolish enough to try to do that, try to cross the border and to go that way without being identified as that and being grabbed.
Right.
And it's not that they all leave either. So this is going back to, doesn't Hamas just move? Israel has been very effective at destroying Hamas's military, despite the constraints that we've been talking about for the last, whatever hour or whatever. Israel's military fights a certain way too. That isn't like others. They're raiding method. It's a raiding military. It's designed to raid into enemy and come back out. But the way they've done that and still destroyed all 5 of those brigades, all 24 of those battalions, then you get to, but John, there's still just as many fighters. Yes, I mean, it's a very radicalized population. That's a fact as well. So the average age of a new Hamas fighter is 16 right now because they have a radicalized population they've radicalized since birth, who is, once they think they're of age, and all of a sudden now you're Hamas, it's the only way to make money in Gaza. But the entire Hamas's military, as in all the named commanders, have been eliminated. Doesn't mean you've won the war because you still have a fighting population that believes that they can win. But Israel's military, again, going back to give it credit where it can, has been very effective at destroying Hamas's military while protecting civilians.
Just back to the point of Egypt. So they decided not to go ahead with these early plans, specifically because they thought they would be helping the quote unquote Palestinian cause. Is that right? By not letting Gazans into Egypt. But not only that, didn't they also agree with Israel to close the Rafah crossing and allow aid to go in via the Karim Shalom crossing on the Israel side? Have I understood that? So why would they even close the Rafah crossing then?
Out of fear of things coming in, I'm sure. There's different time periods because it opened back up. There's definitely lots of humanitarian aid that's flowed through Egypt's border.
Okay.
It didn't close this entire 2 years. There was a period in the beginning, of course, where it was closed in order to control it. Then there was the issue of the Rafah-Philadelphia corridor that caused a lot of tension because...
That was around the ceasefire negotiations at the beginning of 2025. Is that
No, before then. The whole all eyes on Rafah...
Oh, that's the Rafah offensive.
The Rafah offensive was also, but also before that is the Philadelphia corridor offensive, and that caused a lot of problems with Egypt. So during that time, the Egypt crossing was closed because some people argue that Egypt didn't want the world to discover the tunnels that were between here. I personally don't believe that they knew the extent of the tunnel network, even of themselves. And again, people think that just on the other side of this border is Egypt. Well, while that's true, there's the giant Sinai Desert, and you have tribes that live along that area. You have a very small Egyptian military. Looking at the reasons on why Egypt closed its borders, it was this, of course, that political element, but domestically, they're not as strong as people believe as well. I mean, the Sisi government, the Muslim Brotherhood, the threats to their survival are legitimate, and they have to attend to that as a primary initiative.
Okay, so they might say it was for the Palestinian cause,
Right.
but more obvious is that if you have a bunch of people sympathetic to Hamas, which is a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot, that's going to agitate.
And again, history, if that was the reason, why did they eradicate 50,000 Palestinian people living in Egypt, Rafah, in 2017?
They eradicated them?
Well, as in forced displaced, which is a difference between temporarily displaced.
Into the rest of Egypt.
Who knows where they all went. Or back into Gaza.
But
that's a fact. And the UN did report on it, although it didn't, there weren't protests in the United States about it, where the UN reported that they were doing this. But out of counterterror, is what they called it, they destroyed thousands and thousands of homes on their side and displaced that entire Palestinian population on their side of the border.
I'd also say I met and had dinner with a refugee from Gaza who had paid an extremely high fee to evacuate via the Rafah crossing and via the south, and he ended up in Egypt and then eventually went up to Greece. So
the estimate is 100,000 Gazans have left through Egypt if they pay anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000.
Since when?
Since October 7th.
100,000?
Yep.
Okay. And that money's going to the Egyptian government?
Oh, to the Egyptians.
To the Egyptians.
Because you have Egyptian military. Again, we have a Western way of thinking about things sometimes. Like, I understand enough about the Middle East going, just because that went to somebody on the Egyptian border doesn't mean it was going to the government. You have military commanders doing their thing. You have the tribes have been there for a very long time that are experts at smuggling in and out. There's so many elements that profit from this.
Obviously, we haven't got the time to go into it. We've already gone into so much detail, but by the time that the war is moved from the north back down to the south, as we've talked about, we then get to this sort of period. At the beginning of this year, with the 2-month truce, and I just wanted to get your sort of take on how we. I guess I kind of interested in the kind of the Colonel Spencer history of how we get to that period, and just in terms of getting from. I want to unpick that with you so that we can see where we get from there to where we are now. What's your sort of understanding of how the war had progressed by the time the IDF were coming down the south?
So again, 2 years is hard to summarize. You rightfully said we started on the first phase where the IDF targeted northern Gaza because it's the heart of the military. Going back to what we talked about, the three goals for the war haven't changed since October 8th. Return the hostages, destroy Hamas's military and its political power, but also prevent any threat from coming. Militaries are very comfortable, per se, attacking other militaries and destroying other militaries. Mm-hmm. Now, the hostage situation, which is very complex, even for the military, where do they go, right? There's been areas in Gaza that to this day have been untouched for 2 years because of the density and sensitivity of where the hostages are. The likelihood that you could get them without them being killed is very low, just based on the location. As the war progresses, the IDF is putting pressure and destroying Hamas's military, targeting its leadership, as in from the Yahya Sinwar's, Mohammed Def, Mohammed Sinwar on down, but also targeting all the brigade battalion commanders, destroying them in and out, right? These raids. So even when we say they transition from northern Gaza, now they're shifting into central Gaza, like Khan Yunis. They didn't finish northern Gaza. They were doing, like they raided to Al-Shifa to remove that as a military headquarters and searched it, and then left and went back to operating capability. Uh-huh. The way they've approached it has been on doing targeted objectives into the environment to target the military locations that are there, not clear every inch of it, which is there is a way that other militaries might have done it using the clear, hold, and build status of clearing an area, holding it, never leaving that area as you progress forward to get to the enemy in other locations.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea, for many reasons, like the Seven Front War and having to shift almost all forces to the north when that starts, don't hold areas in Gaza. And if they do hold them, they hold them for a short amount of time, and then they pull back and rotate out, and they shift to other areas.
Because it's too exhausting, it's too expensive, or it's not a good use of resources.
One, it's a rotational military.
Right.
So they have to rotate the reserves back. And they have minimum amount of divisions that they had to then put in other areas, like in the north, or just doing other things, or they're rotating and recouping and everything. There is an element here of them also not wanting to occupy and govern Gaza. So to hold an area.
Right. So as soon as the sort of conflict zone moves,
yes,
they're now it's a different kind of game altogether.
Right. So as we show this evolutions, and I know you want to do the evolutions, is that they piece by piece target the Hamas military, and then they went to Khan Yunis and attacked the Khan Yunis battalion. Then they go to Rafah and the 2 Rafah battalions. And they are very successful at destroying Hamas's coherent military capability. And by that, I mean their ability to hold ground as a coherent formation and do operations at that scale, whether it's battalion, company, or even platoon level operations. You still have a guerrilla force all across, because like you said, many elements are saying, I ain't staying to die, and they just move and they try to reform and do operations in other areas. So they went to northern Gaza, went to Khan Yunis, went to Rafah, and then target back to northern Gaza in different areas, wherever the Hamas military they're trying to destroy, while they have to stop at times, right? So of the 2 major ceasefires, they have to pull 100% of everything out to allow for hostage exchanges. So Hamas asked for thousands of prisoners that are replacements as well to leadership and everything, as you have to pull out and then deal with everything. Then you have the humanitarian aid delivery situation.
The prisoners, by the way, is another way in which Israeli the better their behavior, i.e., instead of killing various Hamas people and taking them prisoner and holding them, they then have to send them back. Whereas if they'd eliminated them, that wouldn't be in that situation where they're vulnerable of giving back Hamas leadership. Oh, I understood that correctly, or is that a bit?
It's a little macabre.
Yeah. Sorry.
You can kill somebody if they're trying to kill you. I mean, there's reasons on when you can use lethal force versus capturing somebody.
I don't think killing Hamas high command.
Yeah.
Look, killing is terrible. War is terrible. I think that goes without saying. I mean, I guess we haven't said it in this conversation, but it does go without saying. We both want the war to end, and
absolutely,
etc. But to do that, if you kill the high command, then the war comes to an end much quicker. Hypothetically.
Although that's not always the case, right? This is the ideal. So I've heard somebody say that Israel should have declared victory after they killed Yahya Sinwar, and I think that's ridiculous because
they hadn't achieved any of the goals.
3 goals,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what it declared that, which would have been July of 2024, when they got Yahya Sinwar. If they would have just victory, good enough, we're leaving, and they would have left 50 plus hostages, living hostages behind. Would have left Hamas in power to do what it says it's going to do. It literally would have created such a terrible condition for Israel in general. It wouldn't have been any type of a victory in achievement of military goals. I dealt with this a lot as a professor of strategies. Like, what does winning look like? Well, a military analyst did one side achieve their goal or not? And there are mediums of, like, they achieved their goal of surviving and got whatever it is, and there's land exchanges, there's all this stuff. But in this case, it's pretty clear both sides have very clear goals. Although Hamas is more intangible, like the destruction of Israel. But there's victory for this war after October 7th was just to survive it. And if they survive the war as an organization, not as a living fighter, but as an organization, then they were victorious. They attacked Israel like they did on October 7th. and they survived it as an organization.
We've assumed that, and I certainly would assume that, but do we have intel that that's actually what they were thinking?
We have to take their leadership's words. So we have access to the leaders, and I'm talking about the Qatar leaders, since October 7th. And what does victory look like for them? So same thing when Macron and others designate a state of Palestine, and the Hamas leadership then does an interview going, "Thank you very much. Yes. This is it." He literally, so recently the Hamas leader just in a very long interview with Jared Diamond said, "Look at what we did. Because of October 7th, we got people to designate a Palestinian state."
You literally call it the fruits of October.
That's right. That's right. And their survival is the benefit of that as well. So they will survive as an organization. This gets to the current negotiations about Hamas not existing. The 20-point plan that's been proposed, very detailed, shows how Hamas cannot survive as an organization politically or militarily. But the Hamas leaders are trying to argue that their survival is a part of the Palestinian resistance and et cetera, et cetera. Well, they're willing to give up political control. They want to exist and be a part of it. They probably want what's called the Hezbollah model, where they don't have political control, but they have military control,
right? Which
isn't acceptable as well. But the ideal that
Hezbollah do have some political control.
They do have some political, but they had
three regions.
They're a military within. They're terrorists with a state within a state. They do have some influence, although it's been definitely weakened since October 7th in the actual political apparatus, right? A political party, but their military controls terrain. And
yes.
That's what Hamas would want in Gaza. Even if they don't control all of Gaza, they would want parts where they rebuild their power. According to them, again, like you said, documents or statements, they want to rebuild and do October 7th over and over. But this latest interview where they say that October 7th led to the designation of a Palestinian state, led to Hamas being recognized as a leader of the Palestinian people. That's them articulating victory after October 7th.
Could be, but it could also be them trying to do their own PR and persuade themselves and the people that they govern that they've done a good job and that the sacrifices were worth it. Yeah. A lot of people in the West, particularly in America, Britain, have the anti-Israel types have shown great concern about the support from Western countries to Israel. I wondered whether you might explain, you've already mentioned the bulldozer parts. Mm-hmm. What actual weaponry from America and Britain specifically, I asked for those, I'm probably more interested in Britain given that I'm British, but what weaponry and have we given to Israel, and how was it used during the Hamas-Gaza war?
So I know more about the American because I'm an American than I do the British. It isn't just stuff, although there's some very critical things to include like Iron Dome interceptors that are mostly made in America products. But there's a whole list of just artillery ammunition, mortar ammunition, of course, the different bomb sizes. The 2,000-pound bomb was one that was marked as some type of vicious weapon, and I wrote about that. The MK-84, which is an American, or even the JDAM kit. There's a kit you put on a bomb that makes it more precise. That is again a U.S.-made product. I think you could do this spectrum of what actual end item device, although Israel is a very big producer of military technologies, very advanced technologies that the U.S. military benefits from like the Iron Dome interception or the Trophy active protection system, medical gear, all this stuff. But when you start to parse it down to what product is made, you can get to like Apache helicopter parts, the F-35, which was critical during this war as well, the F-35 and its parts, which you can put restrictions on how it's used and who's it used against.
Yeah.
So you have all the flying apparatuses that have some type of American. You have all of the actual ground items like the Caterpillar, although they make their own systems. There's a lot of interchangeability. And one of the reasons, and this gets to like the disinformation agent or anti-American person that says they don't want their taxpayer dollars going to Israel. So as an American, I can say like the amount of foreign military sales that the U.S. gives to Israel. So we give Israel maybe a foreign military sales amount of money, but then tell them that 90% of that has to be used on buying American products. So this is where the circle goes, as in we're giving Israel something. We didn't really give them anything. We gave them resources to buy a product that they need for their military, but that then drives the economy, our own economy, in the sales of that, and it creates the reliance of that Israel on that product, whatever it be, whether it's the Caterpillar part or whatever.
Is it aid money or is it a loan? Do the Israelis have to pay it back?
There are different variations of it, but most of it's the foreign military sales where they get it, they don't have to give it back, but they have to use the product on American.
So the Americans who are anti-Israel are somewhat justified in saying, why were we sure it's fueling the American economy, but I don't want the American economy fueled this way. And you know, if we're not even going to get our money back from Israel.
If they're anti-war, anti-military establishment, yes, they could do that. Going, I don't want the military-industrial base that creates jobs for.
So that sounds like a pretty sound argument. You don't even have to be anti-Israel; you could be anti-war.
Right. But then they have to do a line item of all the countries because Egypt's very high on that list on how much money goes to Egypt to buy. You'd have to look at this whole element of foreign military sales, and if they wanted to say, sure, you want to cut the factories that create artillery rounds, or whatever. Same thing was happening with Ukraine when they throw a dollar figure out and they say the United States is giving Ukraine. United States is not giving Ukraine very little. Actually, the presidential drawdown was us giving them military equipment and then us restocking our equipment with newer stuff. So there are some people with some validity if they want to be isolationists and say, I don't want any of my money going into the U.S. economy then to support military sales to another country.
Mm-hmm.
That's I think a novice, naive position to have, but they could do that. That's different than saying I don't want my tax money.
Why do you think it's novice and naive?
The post-World War II global international order is backed by the American might, which includes military-industrial base, the evolution of military technologies. Like Israel's partnership with the United States has wedded immense amounts of military capability, which keeps us as a superpower in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And the significance of America staying as a superpower is because if it isn't the superpower and there's a vacuum created, other superpowers will come in and they might not be so...
Even for me, it's not even that. It's that the international order starts to unravel. Like this is where you have like the Russians and the Chinas who say, now that American influence and power is weakened, we'll start wedding, like Russia did with taking Ukraine. Like, what are you going to do to me? I know it's against the UN charter that we set up and everything, but what powers are going to stop me? Nobody. And it's a sitting member of the only body that matters, which is the UN Security Council. So it gets to that, yes, you're right in what you just said, but for me, it's much larger than that. Not only does another power fill the vacuum, and we see this, right? China's influence in Pakistan and other locations and where it's trying to go in Iran, Russia. Yes, there's always a great power competition is what we call it. But the actual backbone to the international order right now is backed by a Western, I wouldn't say just United States, power alliance, which relies on all of these systems, even the naval kind of free flow of goods and services, which mattered. Again, why does the military East matter is that the Suez Canal, the Tehran Straits, all of these things matter in the whole system working.
Yes, as we saw with Signalgate, and
yes, we
saw the Americans having to step in there to protect European shipping. So just after the ceasefire at the beginning of 25, up until now, we had Operation Gideon's Chariot, which is the last great offensive strategy to get us to this situation, coupled, of course, with Trump's efforts and other efforts. But just in that period, everything you've described in terms of the strategy and tactics for the preceding part of the war, did things change for this last part with Operation Gideon's Chariot, or is it a continuation? Is it the same sort of thing, moving to different parts, choosing different parts of Gaza to operate with the same sort of objectives, trying to get the hostages out, remove Hamas. How is it different?
So Gideon's Chariot A, because now we're in Gideon's Chariot B, was different. You had new Israeli leadership, so a change of the IDF chief of staff. You had a change of the minister of defense. You had a change of the strategy in briefing that they were going to push into areas and hold them longer. And this is what they did, is they continued to shrink the areas in which Hamas had freedom of movement. And they wouldn't leave those. So that was the big change in Gideon's Chariot, unlike the raiding of the different areas, going in, clearing them of Hamas in a certain amount of time and infrastructure, and then leaving that area. And then Hamas would reoccupy those areas. Gideon's Chariot was more of a boa constrictor and shrinking the areas in which Hamas would have freedom of movement back onto, using a bigger force, right? So there's this period of time that we weren't able to cover where, of course, there's the operation against Hezbollah when they go down to a single division in Gaza holding ground because they have to move divisions in other areas. So why
would that have been the last couple of months before the Hezbollah ceasefire?
Yeah.
Was sort of November 2024.
Yep.
And so there were, by the way, I think that it was only in the last month that Israel were doing actual targeted missiling in southern Lebanon. I know they were targeting Hezbollah members, but it wasn't until that late period that they were sending rockets to southern Lebanon to try and force leadership to a ceasefire.
Yep.
So that's the period you mean?
Yeah, but there's a period before it. Well, it's not just like moving blocks. Like when they made a decision that the southern Lebanon campaign was about to begin, because there was like a 2-month period where they're doing like 70 raids into southern Lebanon before the ground invasion even begins to eliminate Hezbollah pre-positioned locations, which is what I was talking about. That was their strategy, Hezbollah strategy, is to have all these pre-positioned strategies in southern Lebanon, which they would fall in on if the war began, all this stuff. But most people who just try to look at Gaza go, why has it gone on this long? Why couldn't they just get this done? Of course, you had the civilian population, you have the ebbs and flows of belief of humanitarian crisis, although there have been, of course, humanitarian absolute issues because of Hamas's stopping of aid getting into different areas during this strategy, which is really hard to separate what did the IDF do in military strategy-wise and what's going on with the humanitarian efforts from even the vaccination campaign, which stops everything for like a month when you have to vaccinate the entire Gazan population from polio that was starting to spike. And Israel did that. It vaccinated
When did that happen?
The summer of 24. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It must have been quite something for anti-Israel people in Gaza to take vaccinations from Israel. I mean, you think about it in the West, there's quite a lot of pushback of our own governments giving us vaccines. It's quite something to take vaccines from a government that you consider an enemy.
I didn't see that, though. I saw lots of lines of people thankful to get the vaccination. It's almost
really?
like, absolutely. It's almost
so
like
you witnessed it firsthand. You were there.
No, not the vaccination campaigns, but watching it, the videos.
Okay.
I'll definitely say what I have seen and what I haven't seen.
Yeah.
Because I'm usually with the IDF, and the IDF want to be separated. We want the population separated, but at that time, it's like COGAT, which is a different wing of the IDF, are having more interaction with the population and doing those vaccination operations.
Just as a sort of side point, if I may, the accusation that Israel are committing a genocide whilst they're literally vaccinating for polio. It's such an inversion of the truth.
It is. I mean, the whole list. I mean, the water pipes, the electricity to the desalination pipes, the sheer tonnage of food. Like, it's such an inversion of the truth that it's not even. But there's so many malign actors who have like this nefarious theory, which is the demonization of the Israeli people, that I just can't stand. That, well, of course they're doing that a little bit because they can't do it in the open. Like, look, how nefarious do you think Israel is that they're vaccinating them on this block, but they're slaughtering them over here? They're delivering food over here, but they're keeping them over there starved, and you have emaciated babies over here, but don't look over here.
Yeah.
It's crazy, right? It's the complete inversion of the truth. But from a military strategy, to separate that, because again, the population, all of this would be gone if the population was just a couple kilometers into the Sinai Desert. But to fight within that, right? So what's going on the ebbs and flows of whose election, right? When the U.S. had an election, in 2020, that was a big
2020 or 2024?
2024. November 2024. That was a big, don't go to Rafah, don't even touch it.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
So that holds that operation for 6 months.
Is that right? They actually held it because of the Kamala Harris posting a sort of Instagram meme of all eyes on Rafah. That was actually
But direct threats from the U.S. administration to Israel saying, of course, they wedded it with, until you show us plans. And this is where I quoted, and I'll forever quote this, when the U.S. administration during that time said the correct number of civilian casualties in Gaza is 0, which means you can't fight. Because all Hamas has to do is get a single civilian killed. And when Hamas has a strategy, which we haven't mentioned, which I'll state every interview I've done, I've never studied a military force whose goal is to get its own population killed as its strategy. So Hamas has a human sacrifice strategy where it's trying to get its population killed, if not killing its population itself, to achieve its political goals.
And you've seen the intel
I don't think anybody, just the fact that they say that no civilians are allowed in my tunnels, the fact that their leadership says we need the death of our women and children, that the people aren't our responsibility. Like, I don't need to see that. Of course, I've seen it myself, absolutely. And I've seen the turning every infrastructure, the hospital, mosque, schools into military purpose. But this human sacrifice strategy, like, this is, again, where people that want to make a case against Israel will exclude anything that Hamas says or does.
Operation Gideon's Chariot, Part B.
Yeah, Part B.
Can you explain this part of the operation?
Sure. I think the biggest change in all of the operations has been Gideon's Chariot B. Although there was like in any democracy, a debate at the civ military. So best military advice, civilian leadership, the goal versus the end ways and means to achieve that goal. And people viewed it as some type of disagreement in continuing the operation, which wasn't true. And I just talked to General Zamir, who was being portrayed in the media as just completely disagreeing with Operation Gideon's Chariot B. And that wasn't the sense of it. There were just so many nuances to what were they opposed to, the timing of it and everything. Gideon's Chariot B was the taking on Gaza City. Unlike they had for 2 years, this entire operation, while we talked about northern Gaza, we were talking mainly about the neighborhoods around Gaza City Central. And even going back to the first Gaza war, the IDF have not seriously gone deep into Gaza City, the heart, the densest part of Gaza, everything. Now, we could say, why haven't they for the last 2 years? Well, one, it's where the hostages were being held because it's very defendable. It's very dense. It's very hard to get into, even like to surprise, right? Israel did one hostage rescue on the outskirts of northern Gaza. Very successful, although debatable on the number of civilians that supposedly died. Everybody who dies is a civilian in Gaza, according to the Gaza Health Ministry.
Right.
Gideon's Chariot B, though, was to take on Gaza City, although most people didn't understand the nuances that during the last ceasefire, Hamas insisted that 1 million civilians be moved from humanitarian zones into northern Gaza. So they forced 1 million civilians to repopulate northern Gaza, minefields.
Why did they? I mean, I can see why, the nefarious reason why they would want to do that.
Yes.
Given their tactic of hiding behind civilians. But how could they possibly have sold that to the world as a good idea?
I don't know. I don't know how the world thought that was a good thing. Yeah. Or it escaped the nuance of the last negotiation. They also asked for, so this is where, again, facts are facts. The last ceasefire was 42 days long. That's when they pushed 1 million people back into northern Gaza. That's when they asked for 25,000 trucks of aid. That's a lot of aid. 25,000 trucks in 42 days. And then Israel goes on a 10-week part where they stop allowing aid to go into northern Gaza as they set up the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution sites. But everybody thinks it's a zero-sum game day to day. Nobody accounts for, how long would 25,000 trucks of aid last for the population? No. On this day, Israel cut off and there's zero aid going in.
Oh, I see. Okay. Right.
Yeah, but what about the 25,000 trucks that went in during this 42-day period? That's crazy. But nobody talked about. They thought of it, it's giving people their homes back. Like, no, you forced 1 million people back onto IED-laden minefields of rubble. And then they brought tents and they set tents up next to buildings. But for Hamas's strategy, they knew it would severely complicate Israel ever attempting to go into their stronghold of Gaza City, which Israel never did outside of raiding into it. Like the Al-Shifa operation was go into the Al-Shifa operation, evacuate it, search it, and then leave, and not in that area. Gideon's Chariot B was to take on Gaza City. It actually was to take on Gaza City and the central camps, which is the other area that Israel hasn't touched, really because of its proximity to the humanitarian zone, but also that it's very dense, and that's where hostages are as well. But these two last areas that, in order to go into and actually hold it and clear it for a certain amount of time, the way the IDF do it, as we talked about before, the IDF doesn't hold it for for an extended period of time. Although since Gideon's Chariot A, they've held almost all of Gaza except for 25% of it, which is where the civilians are and these strongholds.
The densest 25%.
Densest 25%.
If it is the case that the hostages were most likely in these dense areas and there was Hamas concentrations, why would they not prioritize targeting those dense areas? Why leave it so late in the war?
There's a list of reasons. Again, going back to each goal can't be separated from itself. So the goal of destroying Hamas's military is very high on the list, right? Their capability. The war is a contest of will, though. So it's ultimately what is giving Hamas the will to continue the operation is the belief that they have this resource, so they lose the military power. And then Gideon's Chariot A also was a shift was the first attempt to remove Hamas's power over the aid. Because of the density of these areas, no aid went into Gaza, not one grain of rice, not one bag of flour, nothing without Hamas control of it. Even though there is civilians who are selling the free aid to the other civilians, but they're paying Hamas its tax for that. Gideon's Chariot A was also
A response to that
by setting up the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to give aid directly to the civilians, which somehow was turned into a bad thing. And Hamas attacked it. They caused chaos at the sites. That evolved, and the GHF and the IDF got way better at securing those sites. But it's all about these powers that Hamas have and its belief that it can continue and will win. That pushes towards, again, the goals of Gideon's A and B are also to push Hamas towards the political negotiation. All war is political. And now you've seen that. Why is Hamas now agreeing to discuss, and we don't know as we're talking if they're going to completely agree to the 20 points of giving the hostages up and disarming, giving up power, every de-radicalization, demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, which meets all of Israel's goals and will bring peace to the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
But it's been a combination. So it's hard for you. You asked me, like, why didn't they do this before? You can't separate the military from the other things that are going on. You can't separate the military from the political goal, which is, of course, the will of Hamas to give the hostages back.
I'm not suggesting with my question that they should have done it earlier. I'm trying to understand why things have happened in a certain order. Yeah. And as you said, you've shown there's a million moving parts, and these things happen as they happen. All the while that Israel, the IDF, don't want to kill their own hostages, which has made...
Don't want to kill, and they also don't want to sacrifice IDF soldiers, to be frank. I mean...
Do we know how many have been killed? I heard about 800, but do we have a sense of how many IDF fatalities?
It's in the 800s. They've had a lot of wounded, too, so they have thousands. They also have a really low rate of wounded to death that other militaries might have. Like we have a wounded person who then turns into dead because the IDF can get a soldier back to a world-class hospital within 30 minutes.
Yes.
That's been lower, but they still have had a lot of injuries. But in comparison, again, I tell people to get out of the numbers games, like the whole civilian to combatant ratio thing. Like just get out of that. That's not how war works. Comparatively, though, the IDF have lost very few soldiers in comparison to the intensity of the combat they're involved in. The dense urban environment with cities underneath you, with the IED threats, with the sniper threat, everything. the IDF have actually have a low, so that also factors into, which was a factor into Gideon's Chariot B, is in if you enter that hornet's net of Hamas stronghold, you're going to lose IDF soldiers. There are things you can do to mitigate and the way you do it, and all these factors are in there. But I mean, war does involve death and destruction, to include your own soldiers, because the enemy's evolving and doing all kinds of things to figure out how to hurt the other force.
Yes, quite. Look, you've mentioned the Trump plan, as I did earlier at the beginning. Passing, we'll come back to that, but I just want to focus on the aid, because there's been so much controversy.
Yeah.
And I think you have already sort of touched on certain aspects here, but it's worth trying to understand. There's so much nonsense that's been said about aid, and so many accusations that have been said about aid, and it's quite hard to get to what the truth is. And of course, what was happening before the GHF was set up is different to what was happening after. There's also the period, as you describe, of the blockade, where there was no aid going in, but there was already aid waiting. Before, is it at all helpful to sort of, if you think I'm wrong, by the way, you should say this, but is it helpful to sort of see, in terms of aid, the Hamas war in two parts? There's the sort of pre-blockade, when UN are sort of dealing with the aid distribution, and there's the time when the GHF are dealing with it. Is that a useful way, or have I?
No, because there's nuances. Because there's even a period in, again, mid-2024, late 2024, where the IDF are trying to deliver aid themselves in the northern Gaza. It turned into what people dubbed the Flower Massacre.
Right.
So the IDF were actually escorting aid into northern Gaza, where there was a population, because of Hamas, that was not getting the full force of the aid. Even where the United Nations kitchens are set up across the Gaza Strip, the northern Gaza, because it's such a combat-rich area going on, it's harder to get food to those people. And those people, to give credit, you have to give everybody free agency. There's a population before the last ceasefire that over 300,000 Gazans in northern Gaza that, no matter how many times they were notified, refused to move south. So, but then everybody criticizes the status of aid going into northern Gaza for those 300,000 people.
Right.
I want to be as objective as possible.
So that's why you, for those who are listening to the podcast, won't have seen that you did inverted comma signs with your fingers there around the Flower Massacre.
That's right.
Because
it wasn't a Flower Massacre. It was actually, again, I wrote about this too. I mean, it was a very deliberate effort by Israel to deliver aid directly to the people, from the IDF to the people, which isn't what's been happening at all. And they were successful on it multiple nights. So in the middle of the night, the IDF would escort convoys of aid into northern Gaza. And as they did that, then Hamas and other agitators decided to come out at 01 in the morning and attack those aids by sending mobs of people to get to the aid. Not as in directly attack it, although they started to attack security positions, which this is, again, people that just don't know warfare, understanding about the IDF wanting to keep everybody away from them, and why they don't want to interact with civilians, because one of the biggest killers in Gaza has been Hamas fighters dressed in civilians walking up to vehicles and either sticking a magnetized bomb to it or throwing one inside of it. So why do you think, like, during this so-called Flower Massacre, which is on the fourth night of these convoys, when a mob of people attacked the convoys, there was actually a group headed towards a tank as well, headed towards the IDF, like civilians who warning shots were fired at, and they kept moving forward. If you're a young soldier in the middle of the night, and there are people moving up to you, and no matter what you do, they won't stop moving forward, it's really stressful situation to the point where you feel a threat, and every soldier has a right of self-defense. But that's happened at the GHF in other cases too, where somebody will walk up to an IDF stationary vehicle and throw a bomb into it. Somebody in civilians. So, of course, they want to keep civilians away from them. But this event that everybody analyzed only from the first night, not the 4 nights of aid delivery, and then it turned into chaos. And then the IDF, separate than the mob that attacks the convoy, to include the drivers and everything, the mob attacks the food. And then they start moving towards the IDF security, which creates this event in which people take the security event, apply it to the convoy. That's why they're being chaotic. and they call it a flat because people get driven over at that point because the truck drivers try to drive out and they drive over people. It is an awful situation. But if you just keep the variables of the context, you might understand why. Then they go, well, wouldn't you do that if you were hungry as well? Like, the nuances here are very different.
So
the aid it's hard to separate aid before GHF or even before GHF is started, which is actually an initiative to give aid directly to the people to weaken Hamas's power of the aid. That's
because the Americans and Israelis no longer trusted the UN to be that.
No, well, I wouldn't put it that straightforward. I would put it from a more military sense because everybody involved knows that that's one of the main sources of power at that point of the Hamas faction is its power over the aid. It's in creating a situation where the people are so dependent on the aid and hoarding it and selling it at a higher prices. If you're trying to break the will of your enemy to continue and to get to a political negotiation, even I on the whiteboard would go, okay, we need to eliminate this power. That's how they're paying their fighters. That's how they're getting new fighters. That's how they know that they can keep surviving this, is that you have to bring aid. They control every bit of aid. And this goes into like the United Nations know that it's all being diverted, like 90% of it, which is also, it gets the nuances of their aid distribution is actually cooking the food and giving it out versus the staple of it and handing the staple out, which is what the GHF does.
Okay.
There's some nuances here. I think it's not because they don't trust the United Nations. I don't go nefarious with the United Nations workers that are inside of Gaza. They're trying to give food out under the recognition that they have to go through Hamas. They have to be approved by Hamas. Everything is Hamas. But if you're the Israeli or anybody who wants the war to end soon, then you would say, if that's the main power in which they have, then we need to start addressing that power as much as we can, which is to give the food directly to people, because there were people who were being kept from food. So Hamas started, once it started sticking, an actual starvation strategy, and that's pretty straightforward as well. As in when that information warfare started to work, because they were saying food insecurity and starvation in November, December of 2023. It just didn't stick as much as it would later in 2024. And then Hamas doubled down on it and started creating the situation more and more, especially in this new test bed of northern Gaza, where they just forced the entire population. To be clear, they moved that 1 million people away from where they were getting food. These people were in the Al-Mawasi expanded area after Rafah. So after Rafah, they moved 900,000 or whatever it was out of Rafah into the central area, the Al-Mawasi Humanitarian Zone, and expanded it. And it had like 400 food distribution points. Hamas forced them out of that into northern Gaza, where they knew it would be more difficult to feed them, and also just more difficult to continue the war in general, because you would have to move the people back. And of course, that's a bad thing. So you start to see the Hamas strategy here tied to the people, in which Egypt and others have allowed to continue without even questioning. I've never seen, and I actually asked General Gallant this.
What do you mean that Egypt have allowed it?
Yeah. So Egypt, again, could have been the sole country that could remove that from Hamas, remove that power over the people, and being the gatekeeper of the aid and all aid deliveries, medical services, vaccinations, everything. But not one.
Sorry, I haven't understood that.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't Hamas, I think you're implying that if they'd used the Rafah border correctly and brought in aid, they would have been,
No, but the people out of Gaza.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean.
And put them into an area they were already building
Understood.
in the Sinai Desert, and then there would not be a single mouth that wanted water or food.
Gotcha.
And Hamas would not have survived for long after that. They wouldn't have had it's pretty factual that that's their main strategy of survival, is that you can't get to them without the civilian population being present, not just as a shield, but also the food strategy, because the world takes the numbers of the access to food and all of this stuff and the statistics and everything. If that was taken away, Hamas wouldn't have survived a few months.
Right. And
nobody, and I asked General Gallant this in multiple interviews, not one delegation, doesn't matter from the UK, US, anybody, ever said, like, well, can't we put more pressure on Egypt to get the civilians out of Hamas's control where we can feed them? It's very straightforward. Not one country brought that up.
Wow.
Not one protest, not one UN speech, nothing.
It might seem like a minor point, but was the UN decision to cook the food rather than giving the supplies directly a way for them to try and get around the fact that Hamas were just taking it in storage? That was their tactic to deal with.
Yeah, it's a pretty standard.
That's standard
method of the kitchens and feeding. Same thing.
Except
World
that it's
Central
so
Kitchen.
much work.
Yeah,
That's.
I mean, they're hiring locals to do that. Just to be clear,
right.
So this gets into the concept of like, who is UNRWA, who are the UN workers, who are the journalists. I mean, they're hired people from the population. Sometimes they vet, sometimes they don't. Which is so when we say UN, and there's a bunch of UN organizations, and then there's the World Central Kitchen, which is separate, and others. But their main way in any conflict zone is to cook it and give people meals directly, rather than give them supplies in which to take and then cook their own meals. Then you have the cooking asset that you have to give them, and all these things, which people don't track, like the cooking oil and cooking gas that gets brought in, all of that stuff. I mean, the bakeries. I mean, COGAT tracks the bakeries. Like there's been 20 plus bakeries producing X amount of bread every day. But anybody who claims genocide, famine, starvation, none of that data comes into any of their analysis.
Yeah. So you've sort of painted a picture when it comes to aid that no matter what time, you basically come to the same problem where Hamas are deliberately trying to sabotage any sort of aid distribution, no matter who's trying to do it. Was there any improvement with the GHF coming in? And your analysis now did that improve things? Even though, I mean, I understand GHF workers were killed, and they had the same problem of having to decipher who's Hamas, who's not Hamas, and hordes of desperate people coming towards them. Was it the same sort of situation, or was it better in any way?
It's absolutely been better. So this is the ideal that I've struggled with, again, studying even humanitarian aid delivery in many war zones, is that what the GHF was experiencing in the beginning was the worst that anybody's ever seen. That's just not true. If you think about even massive humanitarian zone, which is deep in the American history of Somalia, when, thousands, tens of thousands were dying of starvation, the UN sent convoys in of aid. And it almost sounds like the exact scenario of Hamas, and the clans would grab it and kill people that tried to get it. And then aid workers were starting to get killed. And then we tried to distribute it. And then we started targeting those that were targeting the aid. And it turned into, of course, the Black Hawk Down, Mogadishu, all this story. Like, it's a very chaotic situation. And yes, when the GHF started it, it was chaotic because there is no set way to do it. And this is the ideal, and I've been very straightforward with this, just as a fact. There's never been a war where the attacking military feeds the enemy's population during the battle and the war, especially when the enemy still controls terrain and hostages. Not World War I, II, Vietnam, Korea, none of them.
Never in history.
Never in history, because it doesn't make any sense, right? You would think that the enemy is caring for its own population, and that would factor into its effort on whether to continue the operation. And of course, we surround, like in Stalingrad, we surround and starve the military itself, but you can't starve civilians. But there's never been a military in history that I can find, and I've actually had people try to challenge it, and I put the nuances like, okay, that battle ended, and yes, other militaries will feed civilians that are hungry, of course, after the battle. But not in a war, and when the enemy is still controlling the area, controlling the hostages, everything. It's just never happened. So then you go to a GHF, okay, let's start distributing food in this combat zone. I heard somebody say, it's a law of war violation to feed in a war zone. Like, well, what part of Gaza is not a war zone? It was just this idiot. I don't give people the credit.
Don't give them the pleasure.
Don't give them the pleasure of mentioning their name, but they're far-reaching on their understandings of law of war, saying it's some violation to require the Gazans to walk through a combat zone to get to food. The entire Gaza Strip is a war zone because of Hamas. But the GHF tried to initially set up these 3 and then 4 distribution centers, and it was chaos, and it was confusion, and even the civilians trying to get to the locations weren't straightforward on the signage or the routes into the safe area and the way out. And they figured it out. And then Hamas started attacking the sites, like you said, and people were killed, not by the GHF or the IDF, but people were killed. And then there is the element of warning shots at the IDF. I wrote about that. I don't like warning shots. But the GHF now, people visit, and it's not a news story because people visit and it's like, wow, this is an amazing, well-run distribution site. And my friend Matt Tardio just was here last week reporting on, like, this is amazing because that's the way it works when you're trying to figure out something new. Even when Hamas is trying to fight it and trying to figure out a way to fight it, which they were. But now they have like women distribution times, children distribution. It's a finely tuned machine, but it's also has a scale problem. The people that are moving into the humanitarian zone, how do you get to the GHF? And they have plans. I mean, the GHF, before even the bad news, had already started a community distribution process where community leaders would come to the GHF, pick up large loads, and then bring it to their communities and families. So it's definitely running a lot better. It isn't the end solution, of course, but to get people aid without Hamas interdicting and doing all the things that it does to the aid.
The Jordanians and the Egyptians have been giving some aid, right? So most famously is the Jordanian airdrops.
Yep.
Has that been in any way substantial? Was that a successful operation? What's the analysis, your analysis of that operation now?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, if you're a person who's got those are really mostly meals ready to eat, which I didn't enjoy eating myself. But if you're somebody who hasn't eaten, you getting that aid, I'm sure you view it as substantial. From the aggregate, those aid drops were very minor, a bit of the help. But yes, many countries were a part of that, or to include getting not just food, but aid. Because there's all kinds, hospital beds, incubators, like all this aid that's been sent in that other countries have been a part of that has had an effect. There's not one country other than Israel and the United States and the United Nations, which is a conglomeration. You could say like their aid has helped. The airdrops are unique because they're just like putting your finger in the dike of the problem when it is where are the people located and how can you get them the food.
Do you think it was just sort of virtue signaling, or do you think that was meaningful?
I mean, I think it was meaningful and a virtue signal. I mean, I think it was meaningful as some people got food, although then people gripe, well, the aid hit somebody because you're dropping very large pallets of food on. So then there are people complaining that it's hitting people, and it's like you can't do anything good in Gaza other than ceasefire.
Right.
Which I have been a very advocate about. Then you're advocating for the continuation of violence, subjugation of people, the starvation of people.
Sorry, you've been advocating for what?
No, if somebody's been advocating for a ceasefire now, they are advocating for the continuation of the violence in Gaza, the cycle of violence.
Because it'll be a ceasefire now, but it will just allow Hamas the time to recoup, pull themselves together and carry on.
Absolutely. And the way Hamas has governed why are Hamas billionaires in Qatar and millionaires in Gaza, but 90% of the population are dependent below the levels of poverty and dependent on daily deliveries of aid.
Right.
It's because of Hamas's way of governing them.
So this is perhaps something that we might not have too much clarity on, but I was wondering whether there are forces, Palestinian or Gazan forces within Gaza. I know of one at least in southern Gaza who are anti-Hamas, who operate alone. And I wondered how effective or helpful such a group has been, and to what extent is that happening? We've seen anti-Hamas protests. We've seen terrible, brutal executions by Hamas of certain protesters. What is the resistance within Gaza?
So it's hard to know how effective. You're right. The Bedouin tribes in southern Gaza, in the Rafah area, where they the leader wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed saying, I'm not Hamas. I control this area. There's no problem with aid. And I'm hunting and killing Hamas and Israel provided them with weapons, and that was some type of a bad thing because they had some of the supposed nefarious backgrounds. This is, again, where I come in. I'm not a historian, but I'm definitely a student of war, going like, that's a very regular practice in almost every war, is to support the enemy of your enemy to help you achieve your goal, which is the destruction of that entity, political and military. So that was that tribe, clan, really clan. But in Khan Yunis last week, we actually saw multiple clans rising up against Hamas after they demonstrated that exact killing that you just talked about. And you had them, they did multiple recorded video messages saying, we support President Trump's 20-point plan. We're anti-Hamas. We are not Hamas, and we're targeting Hamas after they killed, which is after.
Sorry, after they killed who?
The Hamas, basically secret security police, did a very videoed killing of, I think it was 4 or 5.
Yes. Oh, I see.
I don't know if you saw that one.
Yes, the nighttime sort of execution.
Yeah, those clans in Khan Yunis rose up against Hamas because of that, which is almost the same thing as the protest you're talking about. They killed one of the young teenage leaders of the protest, which then, again, pushes these clans to rebel against Hamas and actually take action against. So now you have these clans in Khan Yunis that are seeking out and killing, and now they've aired some of their killings of Hamas.
Do we know to what extent those clans are operating with the IDF? Is there any collaboration?
We know for a fact that the IDF armed, as in provided small arms to at least the southern Gaza clan.
The Bedouin tribes.
Yes. But you can guarantee that, I mean, there's many forms of intelligence that these clans also help provide intelligence on Hamas, and some of the Hamas leadership might have been targeted through informants and things. Although I also point out that Israel offered, I think it was 5 million shekels for anybody who had information about hostages that would come and give that. And not a single person was awarded that, or so I assume didn't give any information about the location of hostages. The clans, though, back to your question, is, for me, it's very normal in war to do that. So if people say, even if they're bad people, why are you helping them? Because I'm helping them because they're going to help me achieve my goal. And then we'll deal with demilitarizing the Gaza Strip afterwards. The first goal is to remove the power of Hamas. But by the fact that these people can publicly come out, especially these Khan Yunis clans, means that Israel has been successful, despite all the obstacles, at weakening Hamas's even coercive power. So it doesn't have a military anymore. Hamas's military isn't coherent. It's a guerrilla.
Degraded beyond recognition.
Right, which is, a definition is a certain percentage, like 50% capability to do its assigned mission is a definition for us to destroy, and its inability to reconstitute itself, which is always the question, like, how do you prevent it from reconstituting itself? Like getting new fighters, although they don't have the same training and experience. It doesn't have a military. It has a guerrilla force. It still has a really big guerrilla force because it has a radicalized population, which either for self-interest or for radicalized interest will join in the fight.
And do you think it's big enough to reconstitute itself at this point?
No.
Okay.
But which gets to its power to reconstitute itself. Because then you see now its powers are weakening. When you see these clans saying, it no longer is it is of my interest to align with them, to allow them to operate in my city. Even though it's this idea of powers within urban areas is part of my research as well. But for me, it is an ultimate sign that people that argue that Israel hasn't been successful despite 2 years of war. This is the clearest sign, one of the clearest signs that you can give. Not only are they successful at distributing food, they're successful at weakening Hamas's power, so much so that you have clans who are openly saying that they are resisting Hamas in Gaza. Right.
This might sound like a callous question, but I'm trying to put myself in the... I'm not going to for a second suggest that I would be either brave enough or even physically strong or maybe crazy enough to act such a way. But if I was a Gazan and I was anti-Hamas, the war starts. Now, this obviously are not including children and women in this scenario. But if I was a man, as I am at my age now, in my 30s, and I was anti-Hamas and I thought that they were destroying my country. I've spoken to several Gazans who are anti-Hamas. I recently spoke to one who was tortured by Hamas. I'm not sure I would have the courage that he had to stand up against Hamas, given how they were treated. But how do we see these sort of non-combatant males in Gaza? Not sort of including the clans. What's the frame of mind there? Are they sort of trying to? To what extent can they say, I'm not involved with the war? I mean, I imagine if something like this had happened to Britain, firstly, I'm sure I would be compelled to save my country and fight for my country. But that would be assuming I actually liked the government and believed that we're on the side of the righteous. But for that part of the demographic, but perhaps it's a weird question to ask, but how do you think we should think of that demographic?
Yeah, it's hard to, with the knowing of the radicalization of the population, it's hard to distinguish, but you can say they'll vote with their feet, right? So the ones that are moving to the humanitarian zone and not participating in the fight, we can start with those, as in those aren't the males that are staying in areas, doing these, they're still trying to attack the idea, that are holding the hostages, whatever. You could separate them from all of these in the humanitarian zone that are just working to live their lives. I mean, even the markets that they show, just trying to be a market vendor, even though they're paying Hamas their tax, just trying to survive. To be able to distinguish it by just straight looking at it, it would be hard, but you can vote. People do vote with their feet.
Right. I see. So look, we've covered so much, and I'm sure we could speak for hours longer. I also note that there's various different theaters, and we could have done this for each of the different ones. We could have done this for what's happening in Syria, what's still continuing with the Houthis, by the way, which seems to be the theater of war, which will continue beyond the peace treaty, even if the peace plan is accepted and followed through on. But many of these other theaters, if they have not been completely cut down, the enemy has been so degraded that it's not the same conversation that it was. But I wondered if we might actually finish on the peace plan and your analysis of it. It's so frustrating, actually, because we're recording now on October 7th, and we're going to try and put this episode out as soon as possible, but there's every chance that it gets scuppered like the several different ceasefire negotiations have been scuppered over the last 2 years. So really, the listener now could know something that we don't know. But what's your analysis of this deal? Is it something that is good for Gaza? Is it good for Israel? Is it good for Hamas? What's the Colonel Spencer analysis?
Sure. And I've been very vocal because I was surprised at it was a 21-point plan. One of the points they took off was the Israel requirement not to strike Qatar, which was covered in the phone call between
Israel had that point removed.
No, it was negated because Israel made the call and made the apology to Qatar.
Right.
And so now it's a 20-point plan. Just so sometimes people are like, why do you go from 21 to 20? Like, well, they had to point about
because they've agreed that regardless of what happens.
Yeah.
Right.
The 20-point plan for me, one, as somebody who's been arguing with people over the last year about what is war, what are the goals, what's the realm of possibility in Gaza, it's a manifesto of you didn't know what you're talking about. Like the idea you can't defeat Hamas. Hamas is an idea. You can't defeat, it's a resistance, all this stuff. The 20-point plan as written is a comprehensive plan of peace. It absolutely removes Hamas as an actor. If you follow every point of that plan, there is no more Hamas. It will have no role in the political or even societal efforts of the way forward, in which is also critical, the Arab and Muslim majority nations that signed up for this is the way forward. This is not a deal to be negotiated. It's a 20-point plan. It involves number one in and of itself would tell you everything you need to know. The Gaza Strip will be de-radicalized and demilitarized. Doesn't say anything about Hamas. All the hostages will immediately be given back. Hamas will give up all its arms. Like, it is a comprehensive plan, but it also covers Palestinian interests. If you're like, this is just Israel's terms, it does achieve every one of Israel's goals stated on October 8th. Absolutely, definitively covers them. Complete victory. But it also covers any argument of a Palestinian interest separate than Hamas. Even if you say, they were elected, they never had another election, it's just a fringe majority, and then you have the entire population paying the price for the war that Hamas. Okay, fine. If that's your goal, this plan covers every interest, no forced displacement. There'll be a new governance made up of multiple countries, and Israel doesn't want anything to do with the governance plan structure. There'll be a new de-radicalization school program, the aid distribution, every element, and even talks about a path towards Palestinian self-determination in general. It actually puts into this about the Palestinian Authority doing the reforms, which have been one of the greatest hurdles to there being a Palestinian state, has been their representation, let alone the agreements on where the lines are between Israel and a new state if there was one. But this plan actually gives that actual conditions-based plan for a Palestinian self-determination, Palestinian reform, all of the negotiations. So it addresses every issue that any country, whether a true issue or just a political issue, it comprehensively goes through them and leads to the greatest potential for peace for not just Gaza, but for the Palestinian people.
Has Mahmoud Abbas or the Palestinian Authority commented on the peace plan?
I haven't seen that,
okay,
to be honest.
Okay, because presumably if they don't agree to those reforms, it's a moot point.
I do think they have said, because I saw them during the United Nations talking about the reforms that they're already doing. So I think they think they're on that way as well, like the pay-to-slave program that they supposedly are reforming that I've written about, which I think is most people in the West truly don't know what it is. It's a complete societal program for Palestinian upward mobility in the Palestinian society. Is they have to stab a Jew, kill a Jew, something, and then they get free education, free healthcare. Not only the stipends, if they die, their family gets money for the rest of their lives.
Oh, this is from the Palestinian Authority.
It's the current pay-to-slave program that they say they're reforming, which is a big part of the reform. But also, they have to get rid of right of return, acknowledge that Israel exists, all these things. But this, I don't know if he's commenting on the 20-point plan. He might have. I just don't. I've been watching Qatar, Egypt.
Yes.
And now you had Indonesia coming on it, UAE, everybody. But now as we're talking, you have Hamas going, well, we agree to release the hostages, but I don't know if they want to try to deal out of the 20 points. I personally believe not only does this achieve the goals of the war, it actually achieves a path of peace that couldn't have even been thought of before even October 7th.
What are the incentives for Hamas? The Hamas get amnesty, right? So
they could, yep.
That'd be one aspect. But can they go back to their people and sign this with their heads held high? Is this a golden bridge for Hamas, or is it actually a kind of?
It is not, and I don't think that. I think it was foolish to believe that had to be present. I understand why Israel had to negotiate with Hamas because of the hostage situation, which is awful, and the price that Israel has paid for every single hostage, thousands of prisoners in exchange, was just the fact of what is going on, what Israel will give to get a single hostage back. But this 20-point plan it literally destroys Hamas as an organization and as an idea. It starts the de-radicalization. So Hamas could not survive in any way if this plan is implemented as it currently is.
So the incentive for Hamas to sign is this is their last chance to live, which isn't necessarily an incentive. Correct. Because of their martyr culture and the radical Islam nature of their ideology. And the other incentive to sign it would be that the Americans appear to be sending their military into the region again. I don't know if that you can, whether you know anything about that.
I don't think that's a part of the calculation.
But sorry, I mean, it looks like, or let's put it differently. President Trump has said there'll be all hell to pay or something else like that along those lines if they don't sign. So it might be that there's a hammer blow that even Hamas.
So I don't think I think that's important, right? Because anytime there's been daylight between Israel and the United States, Hamas is viewed as hope that they will survive. This plan, for me, there is no incentive for Hamas. And I think it's naive to believe for a Hamas supporter that they have to get something out of this. They get destroyed and they surrender. Some of them, because the Hamas that is fighting today isn't the Hamas of October 7th. That entire leadership structure is gone, all dead.
Yeah.
Now you have the radicalized idea in a certain population of Gaza that call themselves Hamas. But to be clear, it's almost like people want to go, they started it for this reason. Like, who's they? Like the entire Hamas ideology started it for that reason. The entire Hamas ideology is genocidal. It states the destruction of Israel and the complete removal of Israel as a state and the Jewish people. It isn't, I'm not negotiating with that as in whoever's negotiating. This plan, it does give incentives to the reconcilable. This is what we usually say, the irreconcilable kind of terrorists and the reconcilable. Because DDR, disarmament, demilitarization, reconciliation, you actually had people who used to be Hamas who could sign a paper saying, I'm no longer Hamas and I want to live and be a part of this new society. It actually is a path of peace, like other wars where there has been unilateral defeat of the other organization and it doesn't exist anymore. Although it'll exist on the fringes. I mean, there'll be Hamas on the fringes, but from a actual power left. This is what this plan does. It doesn't give Hamas any incentives. It removes any hope. This plan, unlike any other plan that's ever been talked about in the last 2 years, removes an ideal of hope that Hamas could win. Even if they have the old insurgent theory, although Hamas is not an insurgent, there's this insurgency theory thing of where you have the watches, I have the time, where they'll just take their licks, lose whatever they'll lose, but they're just waiting it out until something else changes. That's an insurgency kind of mindset. The Taliban did that, right? They hid in Pakistan, like, we'll wait as long as you need us to. And then this removes hope that Hamas will survive.
Sorry, can you explain to me insurgency theory again? So it just means you can just sit out a siege as long as...
Not a siege, just a war. Just say, the saying is, you have the watches, I have the time.
Right.
It's very common in multiple Vietnamese, Afghanistan. It doesn't matter. It's the insurgent.
Okay.
Or even if you believe in the freedom fighter, just says, this is a matter of time.
Right. I see. So just back to the deal, though, presumably for whatever Hamas leadership are still sat in Qatar, they are, it's them that have got to, they're still representing Hamas and they have got to be the signatories.
Yep.
So the incentive for them to sign is that this is the best possible situation for you. It gets a hell of a lot worse, but it's not a good situation for you, but things are going to get much worse.
Right, because you can't get much worse for Gaza, Hamas, right? They think they had a survival, and Gideon's Chariot B started to remove the ideal of those no-go areas of survival, right? So this is why they are concentrated now into 15% of Gaza Strip, but the noose is around their necks. But the leadership is in Qatar, and as soon as this is why the Trump statement, which I'm proud of as an American, there's no wiggle room here. You're going to do this. But once those Middle Eastern or those Muslim and Arab nations started signing up for the peace plan, it removed Hamas's leadership in Qatar's ideas about achieving a victory. It removed their hope. If Qatar was to kick them out.
So still the problem with that, just to go back to earlier things we've said, is that if they are sort of radical Islamists, and actually death is preferable because then they get martyrdom, and signing this deal would mean to, in their mind, I guess, dishonor the martyrs who had lost their lives. It's all for nothing. I still don't quite see why they would be incentivized to sign it exactly. So,
and that's why the details of the plan are so, it takes away any save face for me in their plans of just surviving and then existing.
So it is a humiliation.
It's a defeat. I don't care about people's feelings.
Right.
It's literally, because even the International Stabilization Force, if Hamas says no, this plan covers that. This plan says, even if Hamas says no to this plan, we will progress forward with creating Hamas-free zones.
Yes.
Now with the backing, unlike ever before, probably in Israel's history, now with the backing of multiple other countries being involved in actually creating that stability in that area. It takes the ownership of the interacting with the population, the clear hold build, all this plan. That's why I've been so supportive of it. Not because it gave this ultimatum or anything like that. The details destroys Hamas whether they want to or not. Bit by bit, even if Hamas says no, I don't care about their feelings and incentives to say it. If they cared about the people, they would sign it. But we've already established they don't care about the people.
Right.
It shows that even if they say no, they won't be able to reconcile. They will be destroyed bit by bit. So it's like the end is already laid out for them. Now they're going to probably try to negotiate some way for them, not to save face, but to see a path towards eventual survival. That's why they mentioned in their one response so far that they approve a technocratic governance of Gaza. But then they, in the next paragraph, talk about they'll always be a part of the process. They want what's called the Hezbollah model, where they, like we just talked about, exist in a society with military capabilities, but technically aren't the government.
They're not going to get it.
They're not going to get that.
They're going to get Tony Blair instead.
Yeah, but the fact that they added that paragraph, we approve the technocratic and Hamas is a part of the Palestinian struggle, will always be a part of the process and responsible. No. This 20-point plan addresses that as well.
Huh. Very interesting. Do you have opinions about the Tony Blair being the possible governor of Gaza, given his reputation?
No. I mean, President Trump's the head of the committee. It says that in the plan.
Yeah.
So, no, I don't have any. I think I don't care about the personalities. I care about the details of the plan and what is said rather than what is not said, because there are a lot of questions, right? There are a lot of questions going forward about who is a part of the stabilization force, who will head the curriculum in the schools, who will do all that. There's lots of questions here, but there's enough detail in this plan that despite the personalities, if that plan was enacted, I personally, John Spencer, believe you would have peace in Gaza unlike you've had for 30 years.
My last question to you. Lots of people who even are pro-Israel might throat clear before they utter their support of Israel with not full-out condemnation of Bibi Netanyahu or displeasure. They might critique certain aspects of what he's done. But from my point of view, having looked at this multi-theater war, I would challenge any of them to say that they think they could have done a better job. And I'd wondered what your take on Netanyahu's leadership has been throughout this war.
So you're asking me to do what I say that I won't do, which is politics. So in my analysis, I absolutely factor the political leadership decisions and the politics of the society in which the war is happening, right? Israel is a vibrant democracy with very unique, even electoral process and the way the Knesset and the votes of no confidence and the majority building and you have the ultra-Orthodox recruitment, like all these issues. That's definitely a part of the decision-making when you say, why did that person make that decision? I agree with you, though, objectively as possible, and I really can't stand analysts who include their personal political beliefs about somebody and then add on the details of why they're making decisions without even knowing or talking to that person. Like I've interviewed him multiple times during this war about his wartime decisions, to include the times when he personally had to make a decision, like go north, go south, execute the Hezbollah operation, don't execute this, respond to Iran while the U.S. president is saying, if you respond, I cut you off. So many elements that I agree that I don't know of anybody else who would have navigated those strategic waters that way with that level of political, even capital in its own society to be able to make that decision, or even internationally to have understanding of making decisions, charting this strategic path. Israel in general, every war I've ever studied from 48, 73, 67, all of them, it's almost unexplainable how they are able to manage the victories that they are despite the constraints and what they're faced with. It's a hard, long way to answer the question. Is I agree with you that objectively, it would be really hard to say if that leader would have made a different decision in that moment, it would have went better. That's the kind of revisionist history, right? Where they imply why he made that decision, right?
Yes.
I've heard somebody say that his lifelong dream was to bomb Iran. Like I've never read that or got that from him. His dream was to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon so it doesn't destroy Israel, because that's what it says it wants to do as soon as it gets it. So yes, he's had a career-long task and objective, and he's written about that in detail, to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. And during this seven-front war, he just, with the help of the United States, but with a lot of leadership and risk to the state of Israel, prevented and set back the clock on Iran getting a nuclear weapon. So I'm saying, yes, I agree with your assessment, and as objectively as possible, I understand the people that hate him. Anybody who's going to be in politics for that long is probably going to be hated by a lot of people.
Yes. Yeah.
But same thing with my own president, although I don't do politics, made decisions, to include during the last 2 years or last year, that have benefited everybody.
Yeah. Colonel Spencer, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Easily one of my favorite ever. Favorite, not because it's a pleasurable topic at all, quite the opposite, but favorite because you've enlightened so much of my understanding. In this fog of war, you have brought clarity where the fog has started to clear in certain parts. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you think was important that we missed? And is there anything you'd like to plug or bring attention to before we bring it to a close?
No, I really appreciated the conversation. I will say the pursuit of understanding in war is one of the hardest tasks, because even the fog of war, even the things that we think we know, sometimes will reveal later we didn't know, whether that's why October 7th happened or all the decisions since, even from a Hamas perspective. 3 things in war will never change. It's human, it's political, and it's uncertain. So that's why I don't do predictions on, like you don't, like what's going to happen tomorrow, even with the 20-point P plan, or for the next war, or if that their war is going to continue. It is uncertain by its very nature.
Yes. Colonel Spencer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with our guest, Colonel John Spencer. Remember, if you want to support the show, to press subscribe and follow, and head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk for exclusive content, videos, and ad-free viewing. That's all at winstonmarshall.co.uk. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and until next time, be well.